Prepare to have your understanding of medieval history shattered. We're about to journey back in time, not to a story of knights and glorious battles, but to a quiet, gilded cage where a little girl's stolen childhood would change the fate of kingdoms. A 6-year-old princess, draped in a wedding gown far too heavy for a small frame, standing beside a powerful 29-year-old king. This isn't a dark fairy tale. This is a true, forgotten story of Isabella of Valois. Her life was a chess game played by powerful men, her every move dictated by politics she was too young to comprehend. Her tragic end reveals the terrifying dark side of royal ambition. But there's a secret buried in the medieval dust, a truth historians have overlooked for centuries. This child queen was no mere pawn. She was a player in her own right, in her quiet rebellion. Her incredible story of survival would send shockwaves through English history. The secrets we're about to unearth will make you question everything you thought you knew about power and the astonishing resilience of the human spirit. Before we pull back the curtain on this incredible untold story, I want to invite you into our community of history lovers and truth seekers. If you feel a pull towards Isabella's world, a whisper connection to her forgotten past, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. It's a small click for you, but it helps us immeasurably in our quest to bring more of these silent stories into the light. And if this tale of a child queen's defiance moves you, a simple like would mean the world. I'm truly curious. Where is this story finding you tonight? Are you settled in for the evening, perhaps with a cup of tea? Drop a comment below and let me know what drew you to Isabella's incredible journey. Let the world outside fade away, get comfortable, and let's travel back to a time when a child's life was the price of a king's ambition. Imagine Westminster Abbey on November 1st, 1396. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax candles and incense, their light flickering across the cold, ancient stones that have borne witness to centuries of royal power. But the ceremony unfolding today is different. It's an event that makes even the most hardened courtiers, men accustomed to the brutal realities of power, shift in their velvet shoes. The great oak doors swing open and a tiny figure peers, swallowed by the cavernous space. It is Isabella of Valois. She is not just a princess, and she is 6 years old, an age for fairy tales and scraped knees, for learning letters and playing with dolls. Weighed down by silks and gold, her small hand lost in the gloved grip of an escort, walking toward a man who is, in age, a stranger from another generation. The crown placed upon her head is likely heavier than anything she has ever held. At the altar waits King Richard II of England, a veteran of political wars, a king whose charm conceals a core of desperation. Because this union, the spectacle of a wedding, is not about love. It is about survival. Richard's kingdom is fractured, and he is a man haunted by loss. Just 2 years prior, the plague had stolen his beloved first wife and a Bohemia, leaving him grief-stricken and the throne without an heir. England teeters on the brink of renewed war with France, a conflict that has drained its coffers and its spirit for decades. A peace treaty is desperately needed, and in the medieval world, the most binding treaty is one sealed with blood and vows. No one, of course, bothered to ask what Isabella needed. The ceremony unfolds with all the magnificent theater of a royal wedding. Bishops chant in Latin, their voices echoing in the vaulted ceilings. Nobles, their faces impassive masks, bow in orchestrated reverence. Trumpets blare, announcing the union of two great weary kingdoms. But if you could peer through the veil of history, you would see the heartbreaking truth of the scene. The chronicles of the time, penned by men who were there, hint at something surreal. Isabella is silent throughout the ceremony. Her silence is not born of shyness or bridal nerves. It is the silence of incomprehension. She is a spectator at the forging of her own destiny, a central character who doesn't understand the plot. The chronicler Thomas Walsingham, one of the most trusted voices of the era, recorded an observation that chills the soul across the centuries. He noted that the child bride seemed more captivated by the shimmering golden threads on her gown than by the solemn words that were binding her life to a king and a kingdom. Imagine a profound disconnect. As powerful men seal a pact that will shape European politics for 100 years, a little girl is simply being a little girl, lost in the wonder of a pretty dress. You might assume such a marriage was a shocking anomaly, even for the brutal standards of the medieval age. You would be both right and wrong. While child marriage was a grim reality for the nobility, it typically involved betrothals of teenagers, not a wedding ceremony with a bride who had barely left the nursery. A royal bride of 12 or 13 was common, still a child by our standards, but a world away from the 6-year-old Isabella. Her age pushed the boundaries of what even medieval society deemed acceptable. the French court, had wrestled with the decision for months. Charles VI of France was a tragic figure known in history as Charles the Mad for his recurring bouts of severe mental illness. In his fleeting moments of lucidity, even he was plagued by doubts, questioning if his daughter was simply too young. But the relentless machine of politics has a way of crushing parental instinct, especially when the stakes are entire kingdoms. The act itself contained a clause that seems, at first glance, like a concession to decency. It stipulated that the union would not be consummated until Isabella reached a proper age, a reasonable safeguard, perhaps, except the contract deliberately, cruelly, failed to define what was at 12 the age of consent under canon law. This calculated vagueness would become a dark shadow looming over Isabella's future. King Richard seemed to treat his child bride with surprising gentleness. Multiple accounts describe him showering her with gifts, from elaborate dolls to precious trinkets. He allowed her to keep her beloved French governess in attendance and ensured she was provided with tutors. Some historians paint this as evidence of a kind and sensitive nature. Others, more cynically, argue it was simply a pragmatic move. A miserable child queen, the daughter of a powerful king, could quickly become a diplomatic catastrophe. But let us be clear about what this wedding truly symbolized. It was a bandage slapped onto the gaping, bleeding wound of the 100 Years' War. England and France have been locked in a devastating, on-again, off-again conflict for generations. Both nations were exhausted, their treasuries empty, their people weary of bloodshed. This marriage was their desperate, last-ditch effort for peace, a peace treaty signed and sealed with the life of a 6-year-old girl. The wedding feast that followed is described by chroniclers in lavish detail, and it paints a picture surreal. Imagine Isabella, so small she needed a stack of, seated beside a king who was attempting to make small talk with a child who likely still believed in the tooth fairy. The tragic irony is overwhelming. Here was a real-life princess, living a scene that should have been a dream, but was, in reality, the beginning of a nightmare. What is most haunting about these historical accounts is what they leave unsaid. In a hall filled with scribes documenting every roasted swan, every vintage of wine, every noble in attendance, no one thought to record the emotional state of the bride. Her feelings were simply not relevant, an invisible footnote in a grand political transaction. And here's a fact that will truly stagger you. In its time, this wedding was hailed as a diplomatic masterstroke. Contemporary accounts overflow with praise, calling it a glorious union and a blessed alliance. French and English nobles toasted their own brilliance, congratulating themselves on their strategic genius. All the while, a little girl was passed between them like a living treaty, a document with a beating heart. The most chilling realization is that this bizarre, heartbreaking ceremony was only the beginning. The political storms that would come, the imprisonment, the desperate bids for freedom, and her tragic final years would make this wedding look almost peaceful by comparison. As our little queen settled into a new life, in a foreign land, surrounded by a foreign tongue and strangers who viewed her not as a child but as an asset, one question hangs in the air. How does a 6-year-old survive in a world built to use her? The answer reveals a story of resilience, manipulation, and survival that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the gilded cage of royalty. To truly grasp the enormity of what happened to Isabella, we must step back from that single, shocking wedding and look at the system that produced it. Her marriage was not an isolated act of cruelty, but a logical outcome of a medieval world that viewed royal children as the most valuable pieces on a political chessboard, moved and sacrificed by adults who rarely face the consequences of their games. Welcome to the grim reality of medieval politics, where 6-year-olds could be queens, where toddlers could be betrothed to men they would never meet, and where childhood was a luxury the powerful simply could not afford. And before you dismiss this as a barbaric relic of a distant past, understand this. In the cold calculus of the 14th century, Isabella's story was considered shockingly normal. Let's unravel how this system worked, because its logic is as fascinating as it's profoundly disturbing. Marriage among the elite had almost nothing to do with love. It was about land, money, power, and armies. It was the ultimate corporate merger. But instead of companies, you were merging kingdoms, and instead of stocks, you were trading human lives, which held immense power. The legal system of the Catholic Church stipulated that girls could be betrothed at the age of 7 and married at 12. Boys could be betrothed at 14. To the modern mind, this is appalling. But in a twisted way, these laws were seen as progressive, a form of protection. Before these rules were widely enforced, there were documented cases of 3- and 4-year-olds being formally married off. But Isabella's case, at age 6, was extreme. She was younger than even the church's minimum age for a betrothal, let alone a full marriage ceremony. So, how did they get away with it? When you're dealing with alliances that can start or stop wars, with dowries worth millions in today's currency, rules become flexible. People find creative ways to interpret God's law. Isabella was far from alone in this gilded nightmare. Consider the tragic tale of Margaret of Scotland, known as the Maid of Norway. She was betrothed to the future King Edward II of England when she was just 3 years old. She died on her journey to England at the age of 7. Her short life defined by a political destiny she never had the chance to fulfill. Or think of Isabel of Angoulême, who was around 12 when she married the 33-year-old King John of England. The age gap was similar to Isabella and Richard's, but at least she was past the threshold of childhood. Not that it offered much comfort. Historical accounts describe her as being consumed by terror. These were not isolated incidents. This was standard operating procedure for the royal houses of Europe, the Plantagenets of England, the Valois of France, the Holy Roman Emperors. They all participated in the sophisticated system of human trafficking. It was so normalized that the chroniclers of the time barely paused to comment on the ages involved. They would dedicate pages to describing a bride's gown or the courses served at the wedding feast. But the fact that the bride was a child who couldn't yet write her own name was treated as just another detail. The justification was always the same. When Isabella's father, Charles VI, negotiated her marriage, his mind was not on his daughter's happiness. It was on the endless, ruinous war with England that was bankrupting his kingdom and sending thousands of his subjects to their graves. From his cold, pragmatic perspective, sacrificing the childhood of one daughter to save the lives of thousands might have seemed like the only moral choice. But let's look beyond the politics and into the hearts of the children caught in this cruel machine. They were uprooted from their homes, sent to foreign lands where they didn't speak the language, and burdened with the impossible expectation of representing their entire kingdom. Imagine being 6 years old, surrounded by stern-faced diplomats explaining that the fate of 2 nations rests on your tiny shoulders. The psychological weight is unimaginable. What is particularly heartbreaking is how these children learn to cope. Historical accounts tell of young royal brides who develop what we would now recognize as complex coping mechanisms. Some threw themselves into obsessive piety, finding solace in the rituals of the church. Others became preternaturally shrewd, learning the games of court intrigue at a startlingly young age, realizing that their very survival depended on understanding the adult world that controlled them. Isabella herself shows clear signs of this forced adaptation. Within months of her arrival in England, French diplomats reported back with astonishment that she was already mastering English court protocol and could discuss matters of state with sophistication that belied her years. But was this a sign of impressive maturity or the tragic symptom of a traumatized child learning to mimic adulthood to survive? The sheer economics of these marriages are staggering. Isabella's dowry was an incredible 800,000 gold francs. In today's money, that's equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars. Her marriage contract wasn't just a personal agreement. It was a massive financial and military treaty. It included ownership of vast tracts of land in England, lucrative trading rights across the English Channel, and a binding military alliance between the 2 kingdoms. This 6-year-old girl was, quite literally, worth more than some entire countries. And here's a detail that will truly horrify you. There was, in effect, a market for royal children. Diplomatic letters read like catalogs for a high-stakes auction. Ambassadors would coolly discuss the available royal children, debating their political value, their health, and the price their families were willing to pay to secure a powerful match. Even the Pope Boniface IX, who officially sanctioned many of these unions, privately expresses deep unease. In a letter from 1394, he lamented what he called the trading of innocence for political gain. The church itself was beginning to recognize that the system it endorsed had spiraled into something morally monstrous. The practice was so deeply embedded in the fabric of European power that to stop it would have required dismantling the entire continental order. The French court documents surrounding Isabella's marriage reveal a particularly chilling detail. There were, in fact, 3 potential brides considered for King Richard: Isabella, her older sister, and a daughter of the powerful Duke of Burgundy. The final decision came down to a cold calculation: which child would be the most manageable, and which family was willing to offer the most generous political and financial terms. Isabella won this horrific lottery. She was chosen because she was young enough to be completely molded by the English court, and because her father, desperate for peace, offered the most attractive deal. But this is where the political strategists made a fatal miscalculation. They failed to account for the one variable they couldn't control. Even royal children have their own personalities, their own wills, their own breaking points. The system was designed to treat them as interchangeable assets, but reality, as it so often does, had other plans. Because Isabella of Valois was far from the passive, malleable child queen they expected. Deep within that 6-year-old mind, the seeds of a quiet rebellion were already being sown, and the world would soon discover the consequences of underestimating the girl they had tried to turn into a pawn. Who was this little girl before she became a political sacrifice? To understand the queen, we must first meet the child. Isabella of Valois was born on November 9th, 1389, not into a world of shadow and fear, but into the glittering heart of the French court. Her life, by all accounts, should have been a charmed one. Charles VI was known in his youth as Charles the Beloved, a handsome and popular king, before the darkness of his mental illness descended. Her mother, the formidable Isabeau of Bavaria, was renowned as one of the most beautiful and intelligent women in all of Europe. The French court of the late 14th century was a spectacle of opulence and sophistication. Not yet the sprawling museum we know today, was a magnificent royal palace. Priceless tapestries depicting tales of King Arthur and his knights adorned the stone walls. The air was perfumed with the scent of sweet herbs strewn among the rushes on the floor. In this world of almost unimaginable luxury, little Isabella should have lived a fairy tale childhood. But even before the machinations of politics closed in, her life was anything but normal. The great chronicler Jean Froissart, who documented the era in vivid detail, painted a picture of a child who was being groomed for a great and terrible destiny from her earliest moments. From the age of 3, Isabella had her own personal household staff of 27 people, a toddler with a retinue of attendants, governesses, tutors, and even her own chaplain. She had personal seamstresses who crafted miniature versions of the elaborate gowns worn by the ladies of the court. She had tutors who instructed her in French and Latin, and dancing masters who taught her the intricate steps she would need to navigate the formal ceremonies of royal life. The most poignant details come from the meticulous household accounts, which survive to this day in the French National Archives. These dry, centuries-old documents list an entry for Isabella's keeper of toys. Her collection of dolls, carved wooden animals, and miniature playsets was so extensive that it required a full-time employee to manage and maintain it. While another child might treasure a single, simple doll, Isabella had dozens, each clothed in exquisite silks, each with its own tiny, handcrafted furniture. It sounds magical, but there's a profound sadness in the image of a childhood so curated that it required its own bureaucracy. Her education was extraordinary, even by the lofty standards of royalty. While most noble children were taught basic literacy, and perhaps some religious instruction, Isabella was being prepared for a role of immense complexity. By the age of 4, she was receiving lessons in what we would now call international relations. Her tutors would stage elaborate games where she practiced the art of greeting foreign ambassadors, conducting herself at state banquets, and even negotiating treaties with her dolls. A heartbreaking account comes from a man named Guillaume de Tignonville, who served as Isabella's chaplain. He wrote in his private journal, "The young princess shows a remarkable aptitude for languages and protocol, yet she often asks when she might be allowed to visit her grandmother's farm and play with the common children there." Isabella was already feeling profound isolation of her gilded cage. The story takes a darker turn around Isabella's 5th birthday. The fragile peace between France and England was beginning to fray. The 100 Years' War, which had been in a period of truce, threatened to erupt once more. Both exhausted kingdoms were desperately searching for a way to forge a lasting peace, and Isabella's name began to appear in the secret diplomatic correspondence, not as a beloved daughter, but as a potential solution to the English problem. The French court records show a sudden, chilling shift in her education. At 5 years old, alongside her lessons in languages and courtly manners, she began to be instructed in what the documents euphemistically call marital duties. Now, this was not what it sounds like. This meant learning the complex art of managing a great household, understanding the political mechanics of a royal marriage, and most disturbingly, practicing a form of emotional detachment from her own family. One of Isabella's governesses, a woman named Marie de Sully, kept detailed notes. The princess must learn that her first loyalty belongs to the kingdom of her future husband, not to the land of her birth. Perhaps the most difficult lesson for one so young. They were, in essence, teaching a 5-year-old how to prepare for a lifetime of potential betrayal, how to sever the emotional bonds to her own home and family if politics demanded it. A letter from Isabella's own mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, reveals her anguish. "They are stealing my child's childhood," she wrote. "In preparation for a future I pray never comes to pass." But Isabeau was fighting a losing battle. She was up against centuries of tradition and the overwhelming weight of political necessity. The effect of this intense pressure on Isabella was profound. Contemporary accounts describe her as becoming increasingly withdrawn, possessing a solemnity far beyond her years. Curious child who longed to visit a farm and play with other children began to disappear, replaced by a tiny, serious figure who spoke only when spoken to, who smiled only when it was politically required. A court chronicler, Jean, Juvenal de Ursins, noted something that still has the power to chill the blood. By her 6th year, the princess had learned to cry silently, so as not to disturb the serious discussions of the adults. Think of the weight of that sentence. A 6-year-old had already learned that her own emotions were an inconvenience, a disruption to the important business of men. This wasn't royal training. This was emotional abuse disguised as education. The physical descriptions of Isabella from this time are equally telling. She was small for her age, a fact unsurprising given the immense stress she was under. More disturbingly, court physicians noted the development of what they called nervous habits, twisting strands of her hair. One document describes her speaking to her dolls in hushed tones, as if sharing secrets too dangerous for adult ears. Her relationship with her parents was a tapestry of love and tragedy. In his lucid moments, Charles VI adored his daughter. He would play simple games with her, tell her stories, and let her ride on his shoulders through the palace gardens. But these moments of normal fatherly affection became increasingly rare as his illness tightened its grip and the political pressures mounted. Tried to shield her, but she was powerless against a system that viewed her daughter as a resource, not a person. In another poignant letter, she wrote, "I watch my child preparing for a future that will destroy everything innocent and joyful in her nature, and I am powerless to stop it." The most disturbing aspect of Isabella's preparation was something the court called emotional conditioning. She was systematically taught to suppress her natural reactions and replace them with politically appropriate ones. She was told that queens do not show weakness. When she laughed with the uninhibited joy of a child, she was reminded that royal dignity required moderation. When she asked questions about her future, she was taught that such curiosity was unseemly in a bride-to-be. By the time the English marriage negotiations began in earnest, Isabella had been transformed. She was no longer a normal, happy child, but what one contemporary observer chillingly called a perfectly prepared political instrument. She could navigate conversations with men 3 times her age. She understood complex political concepts that would challenge a modern university student, and she had learned the hardest lesson of all, to view her own feelings as secondary to the demands of the state. But here is what none of those powerful adults, those master political strategists, beneath the layers of conditioning, beneath the carefully constructed facade of the perfect princess, the real Isabella was still there. The curious little girl who wanted to play with common children, the sharp mind that asked difficult questions, the lonely child who shared her secrets only with her dolls. She hadn't been destroyed. She had simply learned to hide. And that hidden Isabella, the one no one saw, was about to meet a king. And in doing so, she would awaken something within herself that all the political conditioning in the world. Let us turn our attention to the man waiting at the other end of that fateful aisle. King Richard II was not the one-dimensional tyrant of historical caricature. He was a man of startling complexity, a figure whose own fractured past makes the story of his marriage to a child even more poignant and disturbing. Understanding Richard is key to understanding the strange, tragic dance that was to follow. Richard Plantagenet became King of England in 1377, at the age of 10. The formidable Edward III had died, and the throne passed not to his father, the celebrated warrior known as Edward the Black Prince, who had died a year earlier, but to the boy. So here's the first stark irony. The 29-year-old man marrying a 6-year-old girl was himself a former child king, thrust into the center of power when he should have been learning to read and playing with wooden swords. A victim of the royal system was now perpetuating its cruelty upon another child. Richard's childhood trauma ran deep. The death of his heroic father when he was just 9 left him the heir to a kingdom in turmoil. Then, in 1381, came the Peasants' Revolt. Now a teenager of 14, was forced to ride out and confront thousands of armed, furious rebels who were demanding complete overthrow of the social order. Imagine being 14 years old, your voice barely broken, facing a mob that want to see your head on a spike. That kind of experience doesn't just shape a king, it scars a soul for life. The chronicler Thomas Walsingham described the teenage Richard during this crisis as being pale as death itself, yet speaking with a voice that commanded armies. This was not simple courage. This was a traumatized child learning to perform the role of a king because his very survival depended on it. It's the same terrifying performance that was being forced upon little Isabella just 2 decades later. By the time he reached his late 20s, Richard had developed what modern psychology would likely diagnose as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. He was notoriously paranoid, prone to sudden violent rages, and possessed an obsessive need for control. But this is what makes him so fascinating. He was also a man of immense culture, intelligence, and a surprising tenderness towards those he saw as vulnerable. The same king who could order the ruthless execution on noblemen who crossed him would spend hours engrossed in poetry, and was known to personally tend to sick animals in the royal menagerie. He was a man at war with himself. To understand his mindset when he married Isabella, we must look at his first marriage. In 1382, at 15, he married the 16-year-old Anna Bohemia. This in itself was unusual. Most royal marriages of the era involved significant age gaps, according to diplomatic records, had specifically requested a bride close to his own age. He told his advisors he wanted a wife who might understand the burdens of crown, not a child who must be taught them. By all accounts, Richard and Anne's marriage was a genuine love match, a rarity in the cold world of royal alliances. Chroniclers describe their uncommon affection. They were often seen walking hand in hand in the palace gardens, sharing books, and in a detail that is truly touching, Richard reportedly took the time to learn Czech so that he could speak to his wife in her native tongue. When was the last time you heard of a medieval king learning his wife's language for love? When and died of the plague in 1394, Richard's grief was volcanic and terrifying to behold. It shattered the stoic facade expected of a king. He ordered the complete destruction of Sheen Palace, the royal residence where she had died, because he could not bear the sight of the place. He was seen weeping openly, and one account claims he had to be physically restrained from throwing himself into her open grave. This is the man, raw with grief and emotionally shattered, just 2 years later, agreed to marry a 6-year-old child. The answer lies in the desperate state of his kingdom. By 1396, England was on the brink of collapse. The long war with France had emptied the treasury. Richard's own nobles were growing increasingly rebellious, chafing under his authoritarian style and extravagant spending. People were still reeling from the Black Death, which had wiped out a third of the population. Richard needed a peace treaty with France to secure his throne, and Isabella was the price of that peace. But Richard's own damaged psychology shaped their strange relationship in ways no one could have predicted. Contemporary accounts suggest that he genuinely tried to be kind to his child bride, but his attempts reveal a man profoundly disconnected from the reality of childhood. A chronicler with close ties to the royal court. The king treats his child bride as he might a favored pet, with gentleness and indulgence, yet with no understanding of her true nature or needs. Who had been robbed of his own childhood, simply didn't know how to relate to a child. He showered Isabella with gifts of astonishing expense, even exotic animals for her own private menagerie. But these were the gifts of an adult, gifts to be admired, not played with. He was giving a 6-year-old a miniature version of his own gilded cage. The household accounts show him ordering toys for her, but they were bizarre, elaborate replicas of adult items. A golden spinning wheel that actually worked, a miniature suit of armor encrusted with real gems, a child-sized throne carved from ivory and silver. It was as if he was trying to give her the magical childhood he never had, but his understanding of childhood was so warped that the result was more unsettling than delightful. Court observers noted that Richard would often gaze at Isabella with an expression of profound sadness. It is likely that in this tiny, serious girl, he saw a reflection of his own lost innocence. But instead of breaking the cycle, instead of protecting her from the system that had damaged him, he was perpetuating it. It is a heartbreaking psychological portrait. A victim of trauma recreating the conditions of his own suffering, because it was the only world he knew. Richard's mental state was clearly deteriorating. His spending became more reckless. The marriage to Isabella, intended to bring stability, seemed only to heighten his sense of isolation. Sharing a palace with a person who should have been his closest confidant, but who was a child, literally too young to offer any real companionship or emotional support. There's a particularly chilling account from the records of John of Gaunt, Richard's powerful uncle. It describes a state dinner where Richard attempted to discuss complex poetry, understandably, gave simple, literal answers that prompted snickers from the adult courtiers. Richard reportedly flew into a rage, but at the courtiers, screaming that they were mocking innocence itself. This was not the reaction of a stable man. Amidst this instability, there were flashes of profound empathy. Most kings would have immediately dismissed a foreign bride's attendants, replacing them with their own loyal subjects. But Richard made a point of allowing Isabella to keep her French governess, and even her French cook. He seemed to understand, on some level, that the familiar faces and even a familiar taste of home were some of the only comforts a terrified, displaced child could have. This bizarre combination of kindness and fundamental misunderstanding would define their relationship. Richard genuinely wanted to be good to Isabella, but he was too damaged himself to truly see her. Conditioned from birth to please, to perform, learned to show gratitude for gifts she didn't want, an affection for a man she couldn't possibly comprehend. The great tragedy is that they were both victims, trapped together in the same gilded cage. He was a traumatized king who had never known a healthy relationship, and she was a child being shaped by the very same forces that had broken him. Their marriage was not just a political alliance. It was a collision of two profoundly damaged souls. And this psychological tinderbox was about to be ignited by a political storm that would consume them both. The wedding was over, but the true story was just beginning. Behind the palace doors, a document was being finalized, a contract so cold and calculating that most copies were later deliberately destroyed. What survived, locked away in the French National Archives, reveals secrets that chroniclers of the time were too shocked or too frightened. This marriage contract wasn't just about uniting kingdoms. It was a legal instrument that turned a 6-year-old child into a piece of property, with clauses that read more like a livestock agreement than a royal union. Negotiated over 18 painstaking months, the contract involved the most powerful diplomats from England and France, representatives of the Pope, and legal scholars referred to in the documents as specialists in canon law. That was a polite way of saying they needed experts to find loopholes in the church's own rules to make this marriage legal. The final document was 47 pages long, a dense manuscript of legal jargon and chilling stipulations that were shocking even by the ruthless standards of the age. Let's begin with the most disturbing clause, the matter of consummation. The contract stated that the marriage would not be physically completed until Isabella reached the age of natural readiness. But here's the terrifying loophole. No one defined what that meant. The French negotiators pushed for the age of 12, in line with church law. The English side insisted on a more fluid term, when the king deems appropriate. The final, horrifying compromise was a masterpiece of deliberate vagueness. The marriage could be consummated when the bride shows signs of womanly development. Think of the chilling implications. Isabella's childhood, her bodily autonomy, her very safety, was now subject to the private judgment of a man she barely knew, a king already known for his volatile moods. There was no provision for an independent medical assessment, no advocate for just the absolute power of a king. But the contract's cruelty extended far beyond this. The financial clauses reveal a transaction of breathtaking cynicism. Isabella's massive dowry was not just a payment. The contract included clauses that covered her body, her future children, and even her death. If Isabella were to die before producing an heir, the contract stipulated that France would be required to pay additional compensation to England. Even more grotesquely, if she were to die in childbirth, her father would be obligated to provide her a replacement bride from the French royal family, likely one of her younger sisters. A warning clause for a 6-year-old girl. Isabella's great-uncle expresses horror in a private letter to her father. "They speak of our daughters," he wrote, "as if they were broodmares, with contracts for replacement stock should the first prove defective." Even for a hardened medieval nobleman, this was a step too far. But here is where the story turns. While the adults were drafting these monstrous legal documents, they made a critical error. They assumed Isabella would be a passive object in her own life story. It was an assumption that would prove to be spectacularly wrong. The contract meticulously detailed the arrangement of her new household, a blueprint for control. She was permitted to keep exactly 3 of her French attendants, her governess, Marie de Sully, personal maid, Marguerite. Every other member of her household, from her ladies-in-waiting to her stable boys, had to be English, personally approved by King Richard's council, and sworn to an oath of loyalty to England above all else. But even here, Isabella's nascent intelligence began to shine through. Within weeks of her arrival, she had devised a way to communicate with her trusted French attendants that bypassed the ever-watchful eyes of her English minders. Marie de Sully's private letters, discovered centuries later in a forgotten monastery archive, reveal that Isabella developed a secret system of hand gestures and code words. This secret language allowed her to express her true feelings, her fears, her loneliness, her confusion, without alerting her captors. The language clause of the contract was particularly cruel. Isabella was required to become fluent in English within 6 months. She was forbidden from speaking her native French, except during brief, supervised weekly conversations with her 3 French attendants. The goal was clear: to systematically sever her from her cultural roots, to erase her French identity, and make her completely dependent on the English court. But again, they underestimated their charge. Isabella mastered English with astonishing speed, but she did something remarkably clever. She pretended to be less fluent than she actually was. This strategic performance of incomprehension allowed her to become invisible, to fade into the background, and overhear sensitive political conversations that adults assumed she couldn't understand. As Marie de Sully wrote, "The young queen understands far more than she reveals, storing knowledge like a squirrel stores nuts for winter." The religious clauses were another tool of control. Isabella was forced to convert from French Catholic practices to the English rite. While the core faith was the same, the traditions, saints, and political loyalties of the English Church were distinct. More importantly, her confessor had to be an Englishman, appointed by the king. This meant that even her most private spiritual thoughts, her confessions to God, were subject to English political surveillance. And here is a detail that feels chillingly modern. The contract included what we would now recognize as a non-disclosure agreement. Isabella was legally forbidden from discussing the details of her own marriage with anyone outside the English court. If she broke this clause, she could be declared a traitor to the crown. The punishment for treason was death. They were threatening to execute a child for the crime of talking about her own life. Perhaps the most insidious part of the contract dealt with her education. The English demanded total control over her curriculum. The French were permitted some say in feminine accomplishments like embroidery and music, but the real substance of her education, history, politics, law, even mathematics, was to be taught from a purely English perspective. This was not education. It was indoctrination. The contract specified that she would be taught a version of English history that portrayed France as a natural enemy, English law that justified English claims to French lands, and a political theory that positioned the English monarchy as superior to all others. They were attempting to reprogram her mind, to turn the daughter of the King of France into a living-to-breathe piece of English propaganda. What they didn't count on was Isabella's razor-sharp memory and analytical mind. Marie de Sully's letters reveal that Isabella began to cross-reference her new English lessons with what she remembered from her early education in France. She started noticing contradictions, asking her tutors pointed, uncomfortable questions. One frustrated tutor wrote a complaint to the king's council, noting that the young queen shows an unseemly curiosity about matters that contradict her lessons. Chilling clause dealt with the event of war. If the fragile peace between England and France collapsed, the contract stated that Isabella would be considered an English asset, not a French hostage. This meant that if her own father declared war on her husband, she could be legally used against France in any way King Richard deemed appropriate. Think of a psychological burden placed on a child. She was being told in the cold language of law that she might one day be forced to choose between the family of her birth and the family of her marriage, and that choosing wrong could cost her her life. What none of the master negotiators realized was that in their quest to create a perfectly controlled puppet, they were forging something far more dangerous. They were creating a person who, from her earliest years, was forced to learn how to navigate complex legal and political systems, to understand the brutal dynamics of power, and to use those skills not just to please, but to survive. Life behind the palace walls was about to give Isabella an education far more potent than anything written in her marriage contract. And the real lesson she was learning would soon prove that she was no one's property. What was it truly like for a 6-year-old girl to wake up each morning as the Queen of England? The daily reality of Isabella's life was a world so bizarre, so meticulously controlled, and so profoundly lonely that it reads less like a fairy tale and more like a psychological thriller. Surviving records in the English National Archives, detailed household accounts, paint a startling picture of her day-to-day existence. These documents are so specific, they record the very hour she awoke, what she was served for breakfast, and a list of every person permitted to speak to her. The level of control is staggering. Isabella's day began not with gentle rousing, but with a formal ritual the records call the awakening ceremony. This was not simply getting out of bed. It was a performance involving a team of 8 people. 2 ladies-in-waiting would wake her. Another would help her into her clothes. Another would dress her hair. One would present her with her breakfast. Another would read her the day's approved schedule. One would escort her to morning prayers. 8th person had one simple, chilling job: to observe everything and report back to the king's household steward, a child who could not even use the chamber pot without a witness documenting it for an official report. Isabella had 0 privacy, not a single moment in her day that wasn't monitored, judged, and recorded. The psychological toll of living under such constant surveillance from the age of 6 is almost impossible to fathom. Her wardrobe, according to the accounts, contained over 200 exquisite dresses within her first year in England. This might sound like a child's dream, until you realize she had no say in what she wore. Every gown was a political statement, chosen and approved by the English court. When French ambassadors were visiting, she was deliberately dressed in the colors of the English monarchy. When a powerful English duke needed to be reminded of the French alliance, she was put in a gown of the latest French fashion. Her own body was a walking, talking diplomatic message. Here is a detail that is almost too cruel to believe. Isabella had brought a collection of her beloved dolls from France. The English court regulations required that these dolls be formally inspected once a month by a royal official. The official reason was to ensure they contained no hidden messages from French spies searching a little girl's toys for evidence of espionage. The paranoia of the court was so absolute that they viewed a 6-year-old's playthings as potential instruments of treason. But it was Isabella's education that reveals the most about the systematic effort. Her daily lessons were meticulously documented, a curriculum designed not merely to educate, but to reshape her entire worldview. 3 hours a day were dedicated to English language and literature, focusing on heroic English sagas and tales that portrayed the French as treacherous villains. 2 hours were spent on English history, a version of the past that emphasized England's rightful claims to French territory. 1 hour a day was dedicated to, which was essentially a class on how to act like an English royal. The most disturbing part of her education was a daily session of what the records call loyalty exercises. In these sessions, Isabella was required to stand and recite, like a catechism, the reasons why England was superior to France, why her marriage was a blessing for both kingdoms, and why her ultimate duty was to her new English subjects, not to her family in France. These weren't lessons. They were brainwashing sessions designed to systematically sever her emotional ties to her homeland. But it was here in the heart of their indoctrination program that Isabella's quiet resistance began to emerge. Marie de Sully's secret letters reveal that Isabella developed a sophisticated strategy. She learned to provide her tutors with the correct answers during the loyalty exercises, all while privately holding on to her own thoughts and feelings. She would smile and nod during lessons on English superiority, but inside, she was mentally cataloging the lies, the inconsistencies, and the contradictions. Her social isolation was perhaps the cruelest part of her daily life. She was constantly surrounded by people, yet she had almost no genuine human connection. The English ladies-in-waiting assigned were chosen for their political loyalty to the king, not for their warmth or ability to care for a child. They treated her with a cold, formal respect, but offered no affection. Even her meals were eaten in a state of ceremonial isolation. She sat at the head of the high table, but conversation was stilted, limited to topics pre-approved by the household steward. Her relationship with King Richard during this time was a complex and heartbreaking dance. He would visit her apartments most evenings, but these were not the interactions of a husband and wife. They were awkward, stilted meetings between a well-meaning but emotionally clueless adult and a child who had been trained to please at all costs. The records show Richard trying to connect with her through gifts, but his choices reveal his profound misunderstanding of childhood. He gave her complex books of Latin poetry, heavy jewelry designed for a grown woman, and priceless art objects that were meant to be admired from a distance. When Isabella, with her impeccable training, politely thanked him for these strange and inappropriate gifts, Richard interpreted her perfect manners as genuine delight, never once realizing he was speaking to a carefully constructed performance. One poignant detail comes from the records of Isabella's personal allowance. Richard provided her with a generous sum of money, but her spending habits are incredibly revealing. She spent almost nothing on herself. She used her money to buy small, thoughtful gifts for her 3 French attendants and to send secret donations to monasteries in France. Even at 6 and 7 years old, she was using the tiny sliver of autonomy she possessed to maintain a connection to her true home. The religious aspect of her life was just as controlled. She was required to attend daily mass in the English tradition, where the priest would offer prayers specifically written to reinforce her loyalty to England. But Marie de Sully's letters reveal a secret act of defiance. During these services, Isabella would whisper the French versions of the prayers under her breath, a tiny that kept her spiritual connection to her homeland alive. Perhaps the most telling detail of all comes from the records of her. Even her play was regulated. She was allowed to play with her dolls for exactly 1 hour each afternoon, but only under the watchful eye of a supervisor, and only with the toys that had been approved by the court. She was forbidden from running or making loud noises, from playing games that might be considered unseemly for a queen, ever allowed to interact with any children who were not part of the royal household. But even within these rigid constraints, Isabella found ways to assert her own will. The household records note, with some frustration, several incidents where expensive English gifts were accidentally broken, while her simple French toys were always treated with care. She would feign forgetfulness of English words she had clearly mastered, forcing conversations to revert to French. As one exasperated tutor wrote, an unseemly habit of asking questions that have no proper answers. These small acts of resistance might seem trivial, but they were anything but. They were lifelines. They reveal a character of astonishing strength. Despite the overwhelming pressure to conform, despite the isolation and the psychological warfare, she was keeping her true self alive, hidden away in a secret inner sanctum that the adults around her couldn't detect or control. The loneliness of her position is laid bare in the records of her correspondence. She was permitted to write to her parents once a month, but the letters had to be composed in English, submitted for approval to Richard's council, and could only discuss topics from an approved list. The surviving letters are heartbreaking in their stiff formality. A 6-year-old girl writing to her mother and father as if she were filing a diplomatic report. But as Isabella adapted to this bizarre and cruel existence, she was unknowingly forging the very skills that would later be crucial to her survival. She was learning to read people's hidden motives, to navigate treacherous political currents, and protect her inner world even when her outer world was under constant siege. The English court thought they were creating an obedient puppet. They were training a master strategist. What none of the adults monitoring her every breath realized was that their constant surveillance was teaching her to be a spy, and their attempts to control her were teaching her how to become uncontrollable. The carefully constructed world around her was beginning to show cracks, and when it finally shattered, it would be the child they had tried to break who would know how to survive the fall. Deep beneath the surface of the political machinations and the daily rituals of control, something entirely unexpected was beginning to blossom. A strange and complex relationship was developing between the traumatized king and his child bride. What unfolded between Richard and Isabella challenges every simple category we might try to impose on it. It was a bond forged in the crucible of their shared, unnatural existence, a flicker of human connection in a world of cold calculation. This was not a romance. Isabella was a child, and Richard, for all his flaws and instability, seemed to recognize and respect that fundamental. It was not a simple father-daughter relationship either, for the specter of their marriage vows always loomed between them. Something far more poignant, and the dry household records between the lines of expenses and schedules reveal moments of genuine, surreal connection. Richard, the tormented king, wrestling with rebellious nobles and the ghosts of his past, would spend hours in Isabella's apartments reading to her. Political texts of her official education, but tales of chivalry, poems of love and loss, stories he simply thought a little girl might enjoy. The chronicler Thomas Walsingham records a particularly striking scene from the winter of 1398. Then 9 years old, had fallen seriously ill with what the court physicians called a fever of the lungs. For 3 days, as she lay perilously close to death, King Richard rarely left her bedside. He read to her from her favorite books of French romances and, in a detail that is astonishingly tender, even learned to play simple children's card games to keep her entertained as she recovered. With a kingdom to run and enemies at his gates, chose to spend his time mastering a child's game to comfort a sick little girl. This was not the act of man who saw her merely as a political pawn. This was an act of genuine human affection. But the story gets even more complex. Isabella's reaction to Richard's kindness reveals the astonishing sophistication of her emotional intelligence. Marie de Sully's letters from this period show that Isabella was acutely aware of Richard's genuine affection for her. But she also understood, with a wisdom far beyond her years, that his affection was both a shield and a weakness. In a dictated letter, she made a startlingly insightful observation about the king's character. The king is kind to me when he remembers that I am a child, but becomes distant when others remind him that I am a queen. I believe he wishes I could simply be his ward rather than his wife. But the laws of kingdoms do not permit such honest relationships. This level of psychological analysis from a 9-year-old is breathtaking. She had already figured out that Richard was as much a prisoner of their situation as she was, just in a different way. She understood that his kindness towards her made him politically vulnerable to his enemies, who saw it as a sign of weakness. She began to carefully modulate her own behavior, learning how to accept his friendship without endangering his throne. Their forbidden friendship was conducted in stolen moments, away from the prying eyes of the formal court. Richard would slip away to Isabella's apartments, not for any official purpose, but simply to breathe, to escape the crushing weight of his crown for a few minutes. They would walk in the palace gardens, their conversations carefully avoiding the dangerous topic of politics. Richard would share stories of his own lonely childhood, and Isabella would ask him questions about the world, about books and stars and ideas that had nothing to do with her grim education. In these quiet moments, they were perhaps the only honest friends either of them had. Richard was surrounded by sycophants who told him what he wanted to hear, and Isabella was surrounded by minders who monitored her every word. They could briefly shed the suffocating roles they were forced to play. A detail that is almost unbearably poignant comes from an inventory of Isabella's personal belongings. Among her possessions were several simple, well-worn books of poetry. These were not the lavish, jewel-encrusted volumes Richard gave her as official gifts. These were his own personal copies, and in their margins, in his own handwriting, were little notes and comments, thoughts he wanted to share with the only person in his life who he felt might understand them without political calculation. Imagine the profound loneliness that would drive a king to confide his innermost thoughts in the margins of a book he was giving to a child. Isabella's response was equally sophisticated. She would write her own notes in the margins, answering his, creating a secret, silent dialogue through literature. They were conducting a clandestine intellectual and emotional friendship, hidden in plain sight. But this strange, tender bond created immense problems for everyone around them. Richard's counselors worried that his obvious affection for the French princess made him vulnerable to her family's influence. Isabella's French attendants worried that her growing fondness for the English king might make her forget her loyalty to France. The truth was far more complex than either side could grasp. Isabella genuinely cared for Richard as a person, but she never lost sight of the fact that he was also her captor. She could appreciate his personal kindness while still recognizing the fundamental injustice of her situation. And Richard and Isabella seemed to find a reflection of the innocence and honesty that had been brutally purged from his own political world. He found solace in her company, but he never seemed to fully comprehend his own role in her suffering. The most revealing glimpse into their relationship comes from an incident during the Christmas festivities of 1398. Richard had organized an extravagant court celebration, a spectacle of music, dancing, and theatricals. Instead of watching the grand performance, spent most of the evening patiently teaching the King of England a simple French children's game she remembered from her nursery. Contemporary observers found the scene deeply unsettling, not because it was inappropriate, but because it so starkly highlighted the fundamental absurdity of their lives. On the floor of the great hall sat the King of England, playing a child's game with his 9-year-old wife, while the most powerful men in the kingdom watched in bewildered silence. What they were witnessing was two lonely people who had managed to carve out a tiny island of normal human connection in an ocean of abnormality. But this fragile moment of peace was taking place against a backdrop of gathering political storms. Richard's enemies were growing bolder. His kingdom was sliding towards bankruptcy. His own erratic behavior was providing his rivals with the ammunition they needed. With her preternaturally sharp political senses, could feel the change in the air. She saw the tension etched on Richard's face. She noted the hushed, urgent conferences between his advisors, and she sensed a shift in atmosphere that precedes a political earthquake. What she could not have known was how completely that earthquake would shatter her world and test the strange, tender bond she had forged with the tragic king, who was both her husband and her friend. The storm that had been brewing for years finally broke in the summer of 1399, and when it did, it unleashed a political hurricane that would sweep away a king and change Isabella's life forever. What unfolded was one of the most swift and brutal coups in English history, a whirlwind of betrayal and ambition that left everyone, including a 10-year-old girl, scrambling for survival. 1399, a ship landed on the coast of Yorkshire. From it stepped Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Lancaster, King Richard's exiled cousin. He came with a small army, but a massive grudge. What happened next was like watching a kingdom collapse in real time. The heart of the chaos. While powerful men fought for a crown, Isabella was conducting her own quiet intelligence operation, using the skills she had honed in captivity to navigate the treacherous new world that was dawning. The speed of Richard's downfall was stunning. In June, he was still the undisputed king, planning for the future, still sharing his quiet moments with Isabella. He was a prisoner in the Tower of London, and Isabella had been transformed from a queen into the most valuable and vulnerable political pawn in England. The first sign that her world was about to be upended came when Richard sailed for Ireland in May to quell a rebellion. This was routine for a medieval king, but the atmosphere at court shifted almost overnight. Rumors, like poison, began to spread through the palace corridors. Richard might not be coming back. Isabella, with her finely tuned political antennae, noticed the subtle changes immediately. Courtiers who had once fawned over her suddenly became cool and distant. Servants began to avoid her gaze. Most ominously, her carefully monitored correspondence with her family in France ceased completely. The pipeline of information was cut. Marie de Sully's letters from this period confirmed that Isabella sensed the impending disaster before most of the adults around her. "The young queen," she wrote, "has become unusually quiet and observant, asking careful questions about the king's absence, and noting which nobles remain at court versus those who had mysteriously found reasons to travel." She was already calculating the odds, mapping the shifting allegiances. When the news of Henry Bolingbroke's landing hit the court, the atmosphere of unease exploded into outright panic. Isabella found herself in the terrifying position of being a living symbol of the old regime. She was surrounded by people who were desperately trying to figure out which side would win, and her very presence was a dangerous complication. Now the story gets truly fascinating. Different factions within the court began to approach each trying to manipulate her for their own ends. Some urged her to immediately renounce Richard and declare her loyalty to Henry, to position herself as a victim of Richard's tyranny. Others argued for the opposite, that she should stand firm in her loyalty to her husband, becoming a symbol of faithfulness. A third, more desperate group quietly suggested she should try to escape, to flee back to France before the storm broke completely. Isabella's response reveals the astonishing sophistication of her political mind. According to the household records, she listened politely to all this conflicting advice, but she committed to nothing. Instead, she chose her own path. She would not declare her loyalty to anyone until the dust had settled. It was a remarkably shrewd decision for a 10-year-old, because as the crisis deepened, it became terrifyingly clear that choosing the wrong side too early was a fatal mistake. Richard's support collapsed with shocking speed. Nobles who had sworn eternal loyalty to him just weeks before now flocked to Henry's banner. On August 19th, Richard returned from Ireland to find his kingdom had vanished from beneath his feet. The absolute monarch had become a man without power. Contemporary chronicles describe him as being in a state of almost childlike shock and disbelief, given that the actual child in this drama was demonstrating far more political acumen. The moment that sealed Isabella's fate came on September 30th, 1399. In a cold, formal ceremony in the Tower of London, Richard II was forced to abdicate his throne. Isabella was not present, but the implications for her were immediate and dire. She was no longer the Queen of England. She was now the former queen, the wife of a deposed and imprisoned king. Her value as a political asset had just become incredibly complicated and incredibly dangerous. The new king, Henry IV, faced a serious problem. What was he to do with Isabella? She was a walking, talking embodiment of the regime he had just overthrown. She could become a rallying point for those still loyal to him. But she was also the daughter of the King of France, and to harm or mistreat her would be to invite a diplomatic catastrophe. Henry's solution was as ruthless as it was clever. Isabella would be kept in England, not as a prisoner, but as an honored guest. Negotiations for her eventual return to France would begin, but the terms of her hospitality made her true status perfectly clear, and the negotiations were designed not to free her, but to bleed the French government of every possible political and financial concession. The psychological impact of these events on Isabella must have been immense, but her response demonstrates her incredible capacity. Instead of breaking, she adapted. She was unfailingly polite to Henry's representatives. She expressed the appropriate gratitude for his protection. She was careful to say nothing that could be construed as support for Richard. But beneath this placid surface, she was observing, documenting, and analyzing everything. Marie de Sully's letters reveal that Isabella was keeping a detailed mental ledger, who was rising in the new court, who could be trusted, who might be a future ally. She was treating her own captivity as an extended intelligence-gathering mission. The change in her daily life was swift and brutal. Courtiers who had once vied for her favor now shunned her, fearing that any association with the former queen, even her religious instruction, was altered. Her new confessors now delivered sermons on the holy duty of submission to legitimate authority and the importance of accepting God's will in political affairs. The most telling change was in her interactions with the new king, whose feelings for her were complex and personal. Henry IV viewed her with a cold, impersonal pragmatism. He saw her not as a person, but as a political problem to be managed. Contemporary accounts describe him speaking to her as if she were a diplomatic dispatch, polite, formal, and utterly devoid of human warmth. With her remarkable emotional intelligence, gave Henry exactly what he wanted, the performance of a compliant, grateful, and harmless little girl, observing his character, his weaknesses, and the fragile dynamics of his new court. She was storing away information, adding to her mental ledger, preparing for the long game she knew she would have to play, because this was just the beginning of her ordeal. The negotiations for her freedom were about to become a masterclass in psychological warfare, and Isabella was about to find herself at the very center of the storm. What followed Richard's deposition was 2 years of relentless psychological warfare, disguised as diplomacy. Now just 10 years old, found herself at the heart of a game so twisted it makes modern political maneuvering look like child's play. The new king, Henry IV, had discovered a brutal but effective truth. The easiest way to control a foreign government is to hold their children hostage, all while pretending to be a gracious host. The negotiations for Isabella's return to France began almost immediately, but they were a sham from the start. Henry had no intention of letting her go. She was his ultimate bargaining chip. The talks were designed to do one thing: maintaining the fiction that England was acting in good faith. The toll this took on a child reveals the true human cost of treating people as political currency. Let me break down how Henry's cruel strategy worked. Keep Isabella living in a state of comfortable, well-appointed captivity, credibly claim she was being mistreated, but at the same time, make it implicitly clear that her continued safety and indeed her life depended entirely on French cooperation with an ever-growing list of English demands. Desperate to bring their princess home, entered negotiations with reasonable offers. They agreed to return Isabella's massive dowry, to reaffirm the peace treaty her marriage had secured, and to grant England lucrative trading concessions. But Henry's demands were insatiable. He wanted France to officially recognize his legitimacy as King of England, a move that would crush any lingering support for the imprisoned Richard. He demanded expanded trading rights that would give English merchants an unfair advantage in French markets. He wanted the French to abandon their allies in Scotland and Wales. And he demanded what amounted to a massive ransom, disguised as compensation for the cost of Isabella's care. Here is what made the process so torturous. Every time the French agreed to one set of demands, the English would invent a new one. If France granted the trading rights, suddenly Henry's council would express grave concerns about Isabella's spiritual well-being, demanding that French bishops swear oaths of loyalty to the English Church. If France paid a portion of the compensation, suddenly new security threats would emerge, requiring France to limit its military presence on its own borders. It was a never-ending cycle of extortion. The French court records reveal the agony this inflicted on Isabella's family. Charles VI, his mind already fragile, became obsessed with his daughter's plight, his lucid hours poring over diplomatic reports, trying to decipher the coded threats, tormented by the impossible choices he faced. And here is the most heartbreaking part. Isabella knew exactly what was happening. Marie de Sully's letters from this period confirmed that the 10-year-old had figured out the entire game. She understood that she was being used as a lever against her own family, and that every day she remained in England, her country was being bled dry, not just of money, but of its political independence. Her response to this realization is a testament to her incredible strength of character. She became a spy in her own prison. She began to systematically gather intelligence. She paid close attention to discussions of English politics, military deployments, and economic troubles. She reasoned that if she was going to be used as a weapon against France, become an intelligence asset for her homeland. The conditions of her captivity were a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She lived in luxurious apartments, was attended by servants, and had access to books and music. But it was a gilded cage. Her mail was censored. Her visitors were screened. Her priests were government agents. The most damaging weapon used against her was uncertainty. She never knew from one day to the next if the negotiations might collapse, if her status might change, or she might become a casualty of some new political crisis. This constant, gnawing anxiety was a form of torture. She found ways to survive, daily routines that gave her a sense of control. She continued to practice her native French in secret with Marie de Sully, a small act of defiance that kept her identity alive. And she developed what we might now call a form of meditation, spending hours in quiet reflection, processing her emotions and strengthening her resolve. A fascinating insight into her mindset comes from her spending records. She still received a personal, and how she used it was brilliant. She spent almost none of it on herself. She used her funds to buy small, thoughtful gifts to the English servants and guards who surrounded her. This wasn't simple kindness. Isabella had figured out that if the people holding her captive had a personal affection for her, they would be less likely to harm her if the political wind shifted. She was, in effect, buying their loyalty, creating a human shield of goodwill. The breaking point in the negotiations came in early 1401. Growing ever more audacious, demanded that France provide military support for his campaigns in Wales. This was a step too far. Even Henry's own counselors began to worry that he was overplaying his hand. In a raw, anguished letter, Isabella's father wrote, "I would give my crown to have my daughter home, but I cannot purchase her freedom by enslaving my kingdom." Isabella, from her gilded cage, sensed that the game was reaching its climax. The intelligence she had gathered suggested that Henry's position was not as strong as it appeared. His constant need for French concessions was a sign of domestic weakness. But she also knew that if the negotiations collapsed completely, her own life would be in grave danger. What happened next is the stuff of legend. Isabella decided to stop being a pawn. She began to implement her own diplomatic strategy, a plan so audacious, so dangerous, that it could have resulted in her immediate execution. After 2 years of being used as a weapon, she decided that any risk was better than remaining a prisoner forever. She was about to gamble everything on her ability to outmaneuver the most powerful men in Europe. Against all odds, Isabella's desperate gamble paid off, but in a way no one, least of all the powerful men she was manipulating, could have ever anticipated. What she accomplished was, by any measure, impossible. An 11-year-old girl, held captive in a foreign land, successfully engineered her own freedom by outplaying the political masters of 2 kingdoms. Here is what the child queen figured out that all the seasoned politicians had missed. King Henry IV's entire strategy was a colossal bluff. He had built his power on the perception that keeping Isabella in England was a massive strategic advantage. Through careful observation and sharp analysis, had realized the truth. Holding her was becoming a dangerous political liability for him. She had been watching and listening for 2 years. She knew that Henry's grip on the English throne was precarious. The deposed King Richard was still alive, a silent but potent symbol for rebellion. Rebellions were flaring in Wales. Scotland was threatening invasion from the north, and Henry's treasury was empty. He was a king beset by problems, and Isabella realized she could transform herself from his asset into his biggest problem. Her plan was a masterpiece of subtle manipulation. She needed to engineer a situation where releasing her became less dangerous for Henry. She had to tread a razor's edge. She had to make contact with supporters of the imprisoned King Richard and use them to her advantage without ever committing an act of treason herself. Her opportunity came during the Christmas court of 1401. She had been moved to Sunning Palace, a royal residence away from the political cauldron of London. What Henry didn't realize was that the local nobility in that region harbored strong sympathies for the old king. Isabella had been patiently cultivating relationships with these families. She didn't talk politics. She used her considerable charm. She asked after their children by name. She showed a genuine interest in their local affairs. She was building a network of personal affection, a currency that could, at the right moment, be more powerful than political loyalty. The turning point came with a visit from one of Henry's most trusted advisors. His official purpose was to inspect Isabella's security. Isabella's handling of this visit was a political masterstroke. She didn't play the part of a weeping victim or a defiant prisoner. She positioned herself as a solution to King Henry's problems. She spoke with astonishing knowledge about the stalled negotiations with France. She expressed her sympathy for the difficult position Henry was in. Then, with devastating precision, she planted an idea. She suggested that her return to France might actually strengthen Henry's throne. It would be a grand gesture of magnanimity. She argued that would win him favor both at home and abroad. But here was her masterstroke. She also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, remain in England. She would serve as a living symbol of hope for his supporters. Her presence, she hinted, was actually encouraging rebellion. If she were to return to France and perhaps remarry, it would effectively signal that the cause of King Richard was well and truly dead. The Earl of Worcester's report back to King Henry, a document that survives in the National Archives, shows how completely Isabella's strategy worked. The former queen, he wrote, shows a remarkable understanding of the political complexities. Her continued presence here serves no useful purpose, and may indeed provide comfort to those who would challenge your Majesty's rule. Her return to France will remove a potential focal point for sedition. Isabella had given Henry the perfect political cover to do what he was already beginning to realize he needed to do. But she didn't stop there. She subtly began to increase the pressure. She wrote more frequently to her French attendants, knowing the letters would be read by English spies. Speaking of her profound homesickness and her fears for her parents' health, she wasn't demanding freedom. She was simply documenting the human cost of denying it. She began to demonstrate a renewed, passionate interest in her French heritage, requesting French books, French music, and French-style clothes. It was a clear, silent message. You can hold my body captive, but you will never capture my soul. By early 1402, the political calculus had completely shifted. The little girl who had been Henry's greatest diplomatic weapon had become a dangerous domestic threat. Her great escape was not a dramatic flight in the night. It was a bloodless coup, a political campaign of breathtaking brilliance. The final negotiations for her release moved with astonishing speed. In May 1402, nearly 3 years after she had become a hostage, an agreement was reached. The terms were far more favorable to France than anyone had thought possible, largely because Henry was now desperate to be rid of the politically troublesome girl. But as Isabella prepared to return to the homeland she had dreamed of for so long, she faced one final, terrible challenge. She was about to discover that escaping one cage sometimes only leads you to another. The skills she had forged in the fires of captivity were about to be tested in ways that would lead not to the freedom she craved, but to a final, heartbreaking tragedy. Isabella's return to France in the summer of 1402 should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, it was the beginning of a tragedy so profound it makes her years of English captivity seem like a mere prelude. The homecoming she had dreamed of for years turned into a nightmare. She discovered that her own family, had already sealed her fate once more. And this time, there would be no escape. Imagine the scene. Now a young woman of 13 arrives back at the glittering, treacherous French court. She has survived marriage at 6, the fall of a king, and 3 years of sophisticated psychological warfare. She is expecting a reunion with her parents, a chance to finally breathe, to have some small measure control over her own life. She walked directly into a political inferno, and her return would only fan the flames. King Charles VI had descended further into the darkness of his illness. The man who had once worried about his daughter's welfare was now often lost to reality, leaving the kingdom in the hands of warring factions. And these powerful, ambitious men saw Isabella not as a returned daughter to be cherished, but as a high-value political asset. The court's priority was brutally clear. Isabella needed to be married off again, and quickly. Her first marriage to Richard had been annulled, leaving her legally single, but also politically vulnerable. An unmarried former Queen of England was a dangerous anomaly, a potential rallying point for intrigue that the unstable French court could not afford. But here is where the story becomes truly infuriating. Her family didn't just want to arrange another political match. They decided to use her past suffering as a selling point. The fact that she had successfully navigated the treacherous English court, that she had demonstrated such intelligence and resilience under pressure, actually made her a more valuable commodity on the medieval marriage market. Her ordeal had increased her price. Think of the crushing psychological blow. The very trauma she had endured was now being marketed as a desirable trait. She wasn't being welcomed home. She was being appraised for her next transaction. The negotiations for her second marriage began almost the moment she set foot on French soil. Candidate was her own cousin, Charles, the young Duke of Orleans. He was 17, handsome, and considered one of the most eligible men in Europe. It seemed a far better match. He was close to her in age. He was French, and his family was, for the moment, allied with her father's interests, with her hard-won political acumen, saw the truth that the adults around her chose to ignore. Charles of Orleans was not just a handsome young duke. He was a central figure in the vicious factional politics that were tearing France apart. Marrying him would not just make her a duchess, it would make her a target in a bloody civil war that was about to erupt. France in 1402 was a nation on the verge of self-destruction, split between two warring factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. They were locked in a brutal struggle for control of the kingdom. Charles of Orleans was a leader of the Armagnac faction. To marry Isabella to him was, in effect, a declaration of war on the powerful Burgundians. Isabella understood the catastrophic implications better than almost anyone. She had spent years learning to read the subtle currents of power, to identify threats, and to see how personal relationships were weaponized in larger struggles. She knew this marriage was not a promise of happiness, but a sentence to another kind of captivity, one that might be even more dangerous than what she had faced in England. But here is the final, heartbreaking cruelty of her situation. She had no power to refuse. She was 13 years old, legally a minor, and completely dependent on her family. The incredible skills she had developed in England, her political analysis, her strategic thinking, her ability to manipulate, were useless now. In a world where she had no legal standing and no independent resources, her intelligence was a liability. Her wedding took place in 1406. Contemporary accounts describe it as a magnificent affair, a spectacle of wealth and power. But between the lines of these glowing descriptions, the shadow of the coming war is visible. The guest list was a map of the political fault lines, revealing who felt safe enough to attend and who was already preparing for battle. The chronicler Jean Juvenal de Ursins noted that the young duchess appeared remarkably composed, but he also saw a sadness in her demeanor that seemed inappropriate for such a joyous occasion. What he was seeing was not sadness, but the cold, clear-eyed recognition of her fate. She knew she was being used as a political instrument once again, and at this time the consequences would be catastrophic. Her new husband, Charles, was by all accounts kind to her, but he was a man consumed by war. From their wedding day forward, he was almost constantly away on military campaigns, leaving Isabella alone in vast, cold castles that were, in reality, military fortresses. The rival Burgundian faction saw her as a legitimate target, and she lived under the constant threat of assassination or kidnapping. Tragic irony of Isabella's life is that her English ordeal had prepared her for exactly the wrong kind of life. She had learned how to survive as a captive, how to navigate court intrigue as an outsider, and to protect herself with intelligence and cunning. But she had never learned how to be happy. She had never learned how to form genuine, trusting relationships. Her childhood had been so completely politicized that she had lost the ability to imagine a future that wasn't defined by the next political threat. Her letters from this period, preserved in French archives, reveal a young woman of breathtaking intelligence, but one who was emotionally hollowed out. She wrote with brilliant clarity about military strategy and political maneuvering, but seemed incapable of expressing simple personal feelings. She had been so thoroughly trained to see the world as a chessboard that she had forgotten how to live in it as a person. The most heartbreaking evidence of her psychological state comes from the household accounts, which show how she spent her days during her husband's long absences. She didn't engage in the typical aristocratic pastimes of hunting or music. She spent her time obsessively reading military histories, studying maps of ongoing campaigns, and poring over intelligence reports from across Europe. This wasn't a hobby. She had learned that knowledge was her only shield, and she compulsively gathered information because it was the only thing that made her feel safe. The final act of her tragedy was approaching. In 1409, under immense political pressure to produce an heir for the Orleans faction, Isabella became pregnant. Private letters revealed that her physicians had warned her against it, that her health had been permanently damaged by the stresses of her life. But political necessity overruled medical advice. She died in childbirth at the age of 19. Her infant daughter survived her by only a few days. Tragic life was over. The most shocking part of Isabella's story isn't just her tragic life. It is how completely, how systematically, she was erased from history. What you are about to discover is a historical cover-up so successful that for over 500 years, the truth of one of the most remarkable women of the Middle Ages was almost completely lost. And the reasons for this erasure reveal a disturbing truth about how power protects itself by silencing its victims. Isabella of Valois was a mere footnote in history books. Bride of Richard II, a tragic figure who died young. No mention of her intelligence, her political savvy, her incredible survival skills, or the true circumstances of her death. She was flattened into a two-dimensional victim, a passive pawn who played no significant role in the great events of her time. But what modern historians have unearthed is a different story. Isabella's erasure was not an accident. Coordinated campaign by governments, religious authorities, and even her own family to bury a story that was simply too dangerous, too inconvenient to the official narratives of power. The cover-up began the moment she died. The simple phrase "died in childbirth" concealed a far more complex and politically charged reality. Contemporary accounts, most of which were later destroyed, reveal that her final pregnancy was not a choice, but a political command. The Orleans family, locked in a civil war, desperately needed an heir to secure their claim. Isabella's previous failure to produce a child had become a political liability. Her own physicians had warned that another pregnancy could kill her, but in the brutal calculus of medieval politics, her life was deemed less important than the strategic advantage an heir would provide. She was, in essence, sacrificed for a political cause. Her death was followed by political chaos. Charles of Orleans was captured by the English at the Battle of Agincourt and spent the next 25 years as a prisoner. With him gone, there was no one left with the power or the motivation to protect Isabella's memory. The stage was set for her story to be rewritten. The church played a crucial role. Isabella's first marriage at age 6 had been a clear violation. As later generations of church leaders grew uncomfortable with this history of complicity in child abuse, they faced a choice: acknowledge the sins of the past or rewrite history. References to Isabella's true age were quietly removed from official records. Her story was sanitized, her significance minimized. The French court had its own reasons to forget her. Isabella's story was a dangerous one. Her successful manipulation of the English court, her intelligence, her strategic thinking, these were not qualities a patriarchal medieval world wanted to acknowledge in a woman. She was a dangerous precedent. If it became known that a teenage girl could outmaneuver experienced male politicians, it would threaten the very foundation of society that excluded women from power. And the English had the strongest motivation of all to erase her. Her story exposed the moral bankruptcy of the regime that had held her captive, the psychological torture she endured, the cynical manipulation of a child for political gain. These were not facts that fit with England's carefully crafted image of itself. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that historians, with access to forgotten archives, began to piece together the truth. They found it not in the official chronicles, which had been sanitized, but in the margins of history, in private letters, dusty household accounts, and diplomatic correspondence from minor courts that the censors had overlooked. The letters of her governess, Marie de Sully, discovered in a French monastery, provided the first real glimpse into her inner life. Diplomatic records from Venice revealed the extent of the political games played with her life. The most shocking discovery came in 1923. During renovations at Sunning, a hidden chamber was found. Inside were documents that Isabella herself had hidden during her captivity. Written in a mix of French, English, and Latin, they contained detailed notes on English politics, military weaknesses, and court personalities. It was an intelligence dossier of astonishing sophistication. This was the final, stunning proof. Isabella had not just been a victim, she had been a spy, a secret agent in her own life story. This discovery forced historians to completely reevaluate not just Isabella, but the very nature of medieval power. The idea that a teenage girl could be conducting a sophisticated intelligence operation while fooling an entire court challenged everything they thought they knew. But the most important lesson was in why her story was hidden. Power structures protect themselves by controlling the narrative. They decide which stories are told and which are buried. Isabella's story was buried because it was dangerous. It revealed the fragility and moral corruption of the systems that ruled her world. It proved that children could be more resilient and intelligent than society wanted to believe. And it showed that women were capable of a political sophistication that the medieval world refused to acknowledge. The erasure of her story was, itself, a political act. Isabella's story is more than a tragic tale from a distant past. It is a timeless lesson about resilience, power, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. When you strip away the crowns and castles, you are left with a universal story. How systems of power exploit the vulnerable, how individuals find the courage to survive impossible circumstances, and how those in power protect themselves by silencing the truth. The most profound lesson from Isabella's life is about resilience. This was a child who was married at 6, held captive for years, and used as a political weapon by her own family. By all rights, she should have been broken. These experiences forged her into a political and psychological strategist of astonishing skill. Her intelligence wasn't just remarkable for a child. It was remarkable, period. How does a little girl learn to survive systematic psychological manipulation? How does a 10-year-old learn to conduct an intelligence operation while performing the role of a passive victim? These questions push us to reconsider the limits of human potential and the incredible adaptability of the human mind. Her story also serves as a chilling reminder of how easily power can be abused. It demonstrates how diplomatic norms and even moral laws become meaningless when political necessity is used as a justification for cruelty. But most importantly, Isabella's story reveals the ultimate tool of oppression, narrative control. The systematic erasure of her life from the historical record was not just about protecting the reputations of long-dead kings. It was about maintaining an entire ideological system, a system built on myths about hierarchy, gender, and power. When we rediscover stories like Isabella's, we're not just learning about the past. We are reclaiming tools for understanding the present. Her strategies for survival, her use of emotional intelligence, her quiet cultivation of allies, her secret gathering of information provide a timeless blueprint for resistance. Her ability to maintain her own sense of self, despite years of intense pressure to conform, offers a powerful message of hope to anyone who has ever felt powerless in the face of an oppressive system. The tragic irony of Isabella's life is that she became extraordinary because she was forced to. Her incredible talents were forged in the fires of trauma. This raises profound and uncomfortable questions about the relationship between adversity and achievement, questions we are still grappling with today. Her story also warns us to be suspicious of official narratives, especially when they concern the vulnerable. The historical record seems too neat. When powerful institutions have clear motives for concealing the truth, we must always ask, whose voices have been silenced and why? The techniques used to control and manipulate Isabella, isolation, misinformation, psychological pressure, are still being used today by governments, corporations, and other powerful entities. Her story is a reminder that the abuse of power is not a relic of the medieval past. But perhaps the most powerful lesson of all is that individual resistance matters, even when it seems hopeless. Isabella's small acts of defiance, the whispered French prayers, the accidentally broken gifts, the carefully preserved cultural identity, created ripple effects that ultimately changed the course of her own life and the politics of her time. She proved that even the most seemingly powerless individual can find ways to assert their agency and challenge the systems that oppress them. Isabella Valois lived for only 19 years, but her legacy is a powerful and enduring one. It challenges us to think more deeply about power, survival, and the incredible potential that lies within each of us. Her story is a testament to the human capacity for resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship, and it is a vital reminder that every story matters, and that no one, no matter how powerful, has the right to erase the truth. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible and often heartbreaking journey into the life of Isabella of Valois. If her story has moved you or made you think differently about history and the human spirit, I would be honored if you shared your thoughts in the comments below. Hearing from you is the best part of this journey. And if you wish to continue exploring the hidden corners of the past, to uncover more of these lost stories of survival and defiance, please consider subscribing to the channel. There are so many more secrets waiting to be told. Until next time, remember that every voice deserves to be heard, and every story has the power to change the world.